I drove back to my father's farm in Broward County thinking I was finally going to hear something I hadn't heard in months in Washington. The kind of quiet that settles over a field when the wind moves through corn and nothing else. Maybe a few cattle lowing, a barn door creaking. That was the peace I'd promised myself. But when my truck rolled up to the old mailbox with my dad's name half faded on the side, what greeted me wasn't silence. It was engines, alarms, and chaos. Fresh tire tracks carved across the pasture. Orange stakes were stabbed into the soil like some drunk surveyor had played connect the dots on my land. And in the middle of it all stood a woman in a hard hat and designer sunglasses, arms folded like she'd just unveiled a monument. That was Camille Hart, president of the Silver Creek Landing HOA. And the way she smirked when she saw me told me everything I needed to know about how my week was about to go. "Look who finally decided to visit the farm," she called, like the land had somehow become hers while I was gone. Like my father's sweat and my childhood memories were just in used space on a map she could repurpose. She gestured behind her, where workers were rolling paint across a long, straight line cutting through my corn, and for half a second I thought, no, it can't be. Maybe it's a new road, maybe a walking path. But then my other life kicked in, the life I don't talk about much out here. And every instinct I'd built over years in aviation told me exactly what I was looking at. That wasn't a road. That was a runway being born. I played dumb, because sometimes it's better to let arrogance talk first. So I leaned against my truck and asked if she was putting in a new playground, maybe a fancy pool, something small enough that only annoyed me a little, and Camille laughed, that sharp, brittle laugh people use when they think they're smarter than everyone else. Told me the community was moving forward, that progress didn't wait for anyone, least of all for some guy who still cared about corn rows and rusty barns. And if I didn't want to be left behind, I should stay out of her way. I didn't answer, not right then, because my brain was busy measuring distances out of habit, lining up those stakes with the prevailing wind, counting how far they'd cut past the pond. And by the time the sun dipped behind the leaning barn, I'd already confirmed what my gut knew the second I stepped out of the truck. Camille Hart and the Silver Creek Landing HOA were building an airstrip straight through my inheritance. No permission, no conversation, just pure, polished entitlement. Later that day, I walked into Briggs General Store, the place where news outrans cell service by at least 3 hours, and old Harold Briggs looked over his paper, toothpick between his teeth, and asked if I'd come back for some peace and quiet. When I told him what I'd driven into, he just chuckled and said, "Not with Camille in charge," then dropped the bomb like it was nothing. Rumor was she'd been telling everyone she was turning Silver Creek Landing into one of those fly-in communities. Rich folks dropping their planes next to their garages like lawn furniture, landing on a strip carved out of my father's fields. I drove back in silence, my hands tight on the wheel, the sun hanging low over the pasture, and I walked that line again, from the edge of the cattle pen all the way to the tree line, long enough for small aircraft, aligned almost perfectly for the winds in this county. It was clever, calculated, and utterly illegal. And as the bulldozers growled into the evening and the cicadas tried to sing over them, I realized two things, crystal clear. My vacation was dead on arrival, and Camille Hart had just started a war with the worst possible opponent. Because out here, I looked like a tired man in worn boots coming home to fix fences, but back in D.C. I carried another name, the one that truly mattered in this story. I wasn't just a farmer's son. I was the director of the Federal Airspace Commission, the guy who signs off on whether every runway in this country lives or dies, from the biggest international hub to the tiniest strip carved into the middle of nowhere. And Camille had decided to build one in my backyard like it was a backyard deck. I didn't tell her that at first. I went to the Silver Creek Landing HOA meeting instead, the clubhouse smelling like burnt coffee and cheap carpet cleaner, folding chairs lined up in nervous little rows. And when I walked in, every head turned like an outlaw had just pushed through the saloon doors. Camille stood at the front, smile wide, eyes sharp, already mid-speech about vision and the future of the community, and I took a seat in the back, arms crossed, listening to her brag about the project that sat squarely on land that had my last name on the deed. When I finally stood and held that deed up, the same paper my father once folded into his Bible, I told them plainly this wasn't theirs to vote on, that 73% of a neighborhood doesn't override ownership, doesn't erase decades of tax records and titles, doesn't give them access to my fields just because they like the idea of planes in their backyard. There was a moment, just a heartbeat, where the room actually went quiet, where some of them realized how far this had gone. But Camille just smiled that tight, dangerous smile, warned me about fines, about violations, about making it harder on myself. And in that moment, I knew she wasn't bluffing. She was convinced. So I walked out of that beige little clubhouse with my jaw tight and my hands shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of holding back everything I knew, because I hadn't revealed my trump card yet. Not to them, not to her. And as the smell of hot asphalt drifted over from the half-built strip, I promised myself one thing under that heavy Midwestern sky. If Camille Hart wanted to play at building an airport, I was going to teach her how it feels when the sky says no. The next days blurred into a twisted routine, a mix of dust, threats, and paperwork, the kind of grind that eats away at your patience grain by grain. The bulldozers started before dawn, engines roaring so close to the barn the windows rattled in their frames. Dust rolled over the porch like a dirty tide, coating my coffee, my boots, my dog, and my patience. And every time I stepped outside, I saw more of my father's land flattened, scraped, rearranged to fit someone else's dream. That was when the letters began, slipped under my door like junk mail from hell. Violations for leaving my tractor near the fence line, penalties for obstructing community development, fines for not cooperating with board initiatives, all written on crisp paper with the Silver Creek Landing HOA logo at the top. As if stationery could turn a land grab into something respectable. I crumpled the first one, laughed at the second, but by the third, the joke had worn thin. Camille made it a show, too, driving past in her glossy SUV every afternoon, one hand on the wheel, the other waving lazily out the window, asking if I was still resisting. Like this was some game where she collected points every time she pushed me a little further. One morning I woke up to find a sign planted right on the edge of my property. Future site of Silver Creek Landing Private Runway. Clean letters, fresh paint. Standing there like a trophy hammered straight into my nerves. I yanked it out of the ground and tossed it into my truck bed, but that smug promise burned into my brain. At night, when the machines finally went quiet and the cicadas tried to stitch some peace back into the air, I sat at my father's old kitchen table surrounded by piles of paper. The deed, copies of the letters, photos on my phone, the smell of coffee and dust mixing into something that tasted like anger. And above all that hum, there was this constant, steady thought. You don't get to do this to him, not to his land, not while I'm breathing. So I stopped reacting and started building something of my own. I opened my laptop, logged into my Federal Airspace Commission account, and in a sea of bureaucratic noise, one request jumped out. An application for expedited approval of a private runway in Broward County, badly formatted, thin on safety analysis, full of fancy buzzwords about prestige and exclusive access. And when I saw the coordinates, I actually laughed, sitting there alone in that creaky farmhouse chair, because Camille Hart had unknowingly sent her dream straight to the one person in the country least likely to approve it. I hit deny, with more satisfaction than I'd felt in months. But I still didn't tell her who I was, not yet, because there's a particular kind of justice in letting a bully dig their own hole, and she wasn't done digging. I bought trail cameras from town and tucked them around the property, one facing the half-built strip, another by the cattle gate, another high in the old oak tree, quiet little witnesses watching bulldozers crawl across my pasture, trucks backing up with gravel, workers spray painting runway markings like they were doodling on a notebook. I downloaded the footage every night, labeled it, filed it, building a case one dusty frame at a time. Then I started talking to the people who'd been suffering in the blast radius of Camille's ego. Mrs. Alvarez down the road, hands shaking as she told me her windows rattled so hard she thought a storm was coming every night. Derek Shaw, young dad with 2 toddlers, saying his kids woke up crying whenever the machines roared to life before sunrise. They signed statements, simple words on simple paper, but each signature was another weight on the scale. Meanwhile, Camille was selling the future like it was already gift-wrapped. I overheard her one afternoon, standing on the construction site in heels completely unsuited for gravel, telling a small circle of men in suits that in a matter of weeks Silver Creek Landing would be the premier fly-in community in the state, promising priority hangar slots to anyone who wrote a big enough check. I pretended not to watch, but my phone was recording from my pocket the whole time. The cherry on top came in the form of glossy flyers stuffed into every mailbox. Grand opening. Silver Creek Landing Private Runway. There it was in bold letters, with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, champagne, and even a live demonstration flight. I held that flyer in my kitchen with the evening sun slanting through the window and just shook my head, because arrogance has a way of making people believe they're untouchable, even when they're walking straight into a brick wall. So I called an old friend in Washington, a lawyer at the Federal Airspace Commission who owed me a favor or two. Told him I had an out-of-control homeowners board trying to carve an unapproved runway into private land. Explained how far along the construction was, how loud the engines were, how shaken the neighbors felt. He sighed, said it sounded insane even by our standards, and promised to draft a cease and desist order with every legal nail he could hammer into it. All I had to do was say when. I checked my cameras, organized the witness statements, stacked the photos and contracts and flyers into a thick, satisfying folder, and every time Camille drove by with that same practiced smile, every time she threatened another fine or dropped another notice under my door, I could barely stop myself from laughing, because the whole time she thought I was just the stubborn farmer in the way, she was building Exhibit A against herself. So when the morning of the grand opening finally rolled around, heat already shimmering over the field, banners flapping in the wind, champagne glasses sweating on a plastic table, a twin-engine plane circling overhead like some kind of coronation, I slid my Federal Airspace Commission badge into my pocket, adjusted my old ball cap, and walked toward the crowd as quietly as a storm rolling in behind the horizon. By the time I reached the makeshift stage, Silver Creek Landing looked less like a neighborhood and more like a county fair gone wrong. Folding chairs in crooked rows, kids tugging at their parents' sleeves, investors in suits fanning themselves with the same brochures that had promised them exclusive runway access. And at the center of it all stood Camille Hart, white blazer spotless despite the dust, microphone in hand, sunglasses reflecting the crowd back at itself. She talked about history and vision, about joining the elite, about how this strip of scorched asphalt cutting through my father's corn would change everything. The crowd clapped on cue, some because they believed her, others because they were afraid not to, and as she raised her glass of champagne toward the circling plane, as she declared that, "Today we welcome our first official landing," I finally stepped forward. At first no one noticed, just another man in jeans and a faded cap walking up the side of the runway. But whispers spread the closer I got, neighbors nudging each other, a couple of workers going quiet. I stopped right at the red ribbon she'd strung across the strip and called her name, steady, loud enough to cut through the loudspeakers. And when she tried to wave me off, tried to say there'd be time for questions later, I pulled the badge from my pocket and held it up where everyone, and every camera, could see. "My name is Graham Keller," I said, feeling the weight of the past weeks, the engines, the letters, the sleepless nights, all pressing into that single moment. "And I am the director of the Federal Airspace Commission. As of right now, this runway is shut down." The silence that hit us was almost physical, like the whole crowd inhaled and forgot how to breathe. Then everything fractured at once. Investors muttering curses under their breath, neighbors gasping, reporters from the local station lunging forward with their cameras and mics, the plane overhead dipping lower before hesitating. The pilot clearly reading the signals from the sheriff's deputies I'd briefed an hour earlier. "You can't do this," Camille stammered, voice suddenly too small for the mic, face draining of color. "We have approvals, we followed the process," and I almost felt bad for her in that flash. Almost, because she still didn't get it, still thought this was some neighborhood squabble she could outvote. So I told the truth plainly, for her, for the cameras, for the people who'd been shaken awake at 2 a.m. by bulldozers and dust. I explained that the application had been denied, personally, that there was no environmental review, no appropriate safety filings, no legal authority to carve an airstrip into someone else's farm, that every contract promising priority hangar space on this not approved, not legal strip of asphalt was built on thin air, and as I spoke, the deputies handed me the cease and desist order, stamped and signed, the paper that turned all of this from an argument into a verdict. I read the key lines out loud, about immediate suspension of all construction and operations, about potential fines and demolition orders, about investigation into fraudulent claims made by the Silver Creek Landing HOA. then placed a copy into Camille's shaking hand, watched it slip through her fingers and float to the ground like a surrender flag she never meant to wave. The plane above banked away, engines roaring as it climbed, and the sound of that aborted landing felt like the sky itself saying no. The crowd started to clap, hesitant at first, then stronger, a wave that rolled over the runway and washed right over Camille's carefully staged future. I saw anger on investors' faces now turned fully toward her, heard neighbors shouting about mailbox fines and landscaping fees and years of petty humiliation, all of it surfacing in the same breath. When the sheriff stepped forward and told Camille Hart she'd need to come down to answer questions about the money collected, the contract signed, the way she'd sold a runway that didn't exist in the eyes of the law, the gasp that went up wasn't shock. It was relief, the kind of sound people make when the person who's been sitting on their chest finally gets dragged off. I didn't gloat, not outwardly. I just picked up one of the forgotten champagne glasses, lifted it toward the crowd, and said that maybe what this place needed wasn't jets and asphalt, but sleep and quiet, and the sound of wind in the corn again. People laughed, some wiped at their eyes. The cameras caught Camille being led back toward her SUV, sunglasses gone, shoulders tight. The image that would loop on local news before the internet turned it into a punchline. In the weeks that followed, the storm kept rolling, just not over my roof. The video of the shutdown went everywhere, headlines talking about a rogue homeowner's board and a backyard runway scandal. The Silver Creek Landing HOA held an emergency meeting without Camille, and from what I heard, they didn't just vote her out. They dismantled the little kingdom she'd built around fear and fines. My friends at the Federal Airspace Commission moved fast, leveling penalties that would make any board rethink ever trying something like this again. Demolition crews showed up and peeled the runway out of the earth, chunk by chunk, hauling away the black scar, refilling the field with clean soil, and I stood there one evening, hands in my pockets, watching the sun sink over a land that finally looked like a farm again, faint traces of asphalt still ghosting under the dirt, like a bad idea the soil was slowly forgetting, and I thought of my father, of how he'd have shaken his head, maybe muttered a few choice words, and grinned when he heard how it ended. Neighbors came by more, Mrs. Alvarez with a pie and a hug, Derek offering to help mend the fence that the trucks had mangled, even Harold Briggs tipping his cap, and saying it was about time someone clipped Camille's wings. I told them all the same thing. I didn't do it for applause or revenge clicks online. I did it because some lines matter, because land matters, because laws exist for a reason, especially when someone decides they're too important to follow them. Life settled back into something like normal after that. I replanted, stretched wire, finally got that nap under the old tree I'd been daydreaming about. And every time a jet passed way up high, just a glint of silver crossing the blue, I couldn't help but smile a little, thinking about the shortest, loudest, most illegal airstrip I'd ever shut down, tucked into a neighborhood that thought it could vote its way into having an airport. In the end, this story isn't really about airplanes or asphalt. It's about what happens when pride and greed convince someone they're above limits, above neighbors, above the ground they're standing on. Camille Hart thought she could turn my father's fields into her private runway, thought titles and votes could replace respect and permission, and in the end the only thing that truly took off was her ego, and it came down hard. So I'll leave you with this, because I know a lot of you listening have your own versions of a Camille, maybe in an office, maybe next door, maybe sitting at the head of some petty little board with a clipboard and a power trip. When someone like that starts bulldozing over your life in the name of progress, where do you draw the line? What's the right way to fight back without becoming them? And when justice finally shows up, is it enough just to win? Or do we owe each other something more than revenge?